I was going to review very quickly what we did yesterday. So the bottom line of Daf Samachet Amabet, and I apologize, I have a Gemara on my screen, is the Boy Rava. Rava asked the following question, right? Le'inyan ma'aser mai. So the question we had yesterday, a very interesting question, which is that there are times where you plant something and then you replant it. And basically, the main part that you planted, you already took maaser. Remember the cases yesterday where the main part was kilayim, so it's prohibited, where the main part was Arla in the first 3 years, so it was prohibited. And the question was, if you then replanted it or added something to it and it grew more, does the addition remain usr like the first part? Does the addition mevatel the first part? And we said that for sure it remains usr. We weren't sure if it was for because we know for sure that you go with the ikar, with the first thing, or because we are misupak, we're unsure about it. So then Rava said, what about linyan maaser? So we said yesterday, hekidami, kigon, and this now at the top of daf ayin amid aleph, which we read already. Da'amdinu ve'asrinu, you basically you cut down or you uprooted your grain plants, you put them in a pile, you took maaser from them, so they're appropriate now, you could take them home and eat them. But instead of taking them home, Vishaltinu, you replanted them, Vosipolo, and then they kept growing. And so the question well, two questions. One is the first part that you took Maaser pater the rest of it? So we don't know. But second of all, if it doesn't, in second line, Imtim Salomar, Lo aslinam batar ikar. If you say that you don't go after the main part, and therefore the added part requires maaser on its own, right? What about the main part? What about ikar mai? So these grains grew another 20%. So now you have, 12, say, portions of grain, but 10 of them you already took maaser. Do you have to take maaser again? So said Abaya, of course you do. It's the same thing as every time when you plant wheat and barley, you take a seed that you already took maaser on, you put it in the ground, and it grows a plant. And you take maaser on the whole plant. You don't say, deduct the maaser I already did on the seed. Amalei, but Rava said that's not very similar because a seed is davar shazaro kaleh. When you plant something, the seed basically disappears, meaning it goes in the ground, it opens up, it cracks open, it absorbs, the thing grows, but you basically don't see the seed anymore. We are reviewing, as you know, at the top of Daf Ayin Amud Aleph. We read this already yesterday. So this was Rava's answer to Abaya, was that you can't ask me a proof from a seed. The fact that you take a seed and you plant it, of course you need maaser on everything that grows from that. But what if you take an intact plant that you already took maaser on and you replant it and it grows some more? Do you now have to take maaser on the entire plant, including the main part that you already took maaser on? That was the question. So, where am I? Elakikami Baili, my question, says Rava, is davar she'ein zaro kaleh. Something where the seed is not obliterated, right? Because you're actually planting a plant. You're not planting a seed that never is apparent again. You're putting a stalk into the ground, and now it's just getting bigger. So, what's the halacha in that case? So we answered today, and this is 7 lines from the top, first one on the line. Tivshon lemeha. We could prove it from the following statement. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan said something very similar in the case of onions. Right now, onions, of course, are very different than seeds because I don't know that much about onions, but I think I know enough to know that when you plant an onion, you actually take the bulb, you put it in the ground, and it starts growing, gets bigger and bigger, right? So let's say, said Rabbi Yochanan, said Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yochanan, if you take a litra batzal, you take a liter, whatever that means, not a liter, but litra of onions, shetiknu, you already fixed them, meaning you already took truma and maaser from them, and then zaro, and then you plant them into a field, and you grow a whole field, 10 liters now of onions. What do? Do you subtract that original liter? Said Rabbi Yochanan, no, mitaser lefi kulo, that you take maaser for the entire crop that comes out at the end, even though you put some already into the ground. And that, of course, onions are not like seeds. They are intact. You don't lose the onion. Says Rava, it still doesn't answer my question because hatam hainzri ato. That's the way you're supposed to plant onions. I mean, it's sort of normal thing. You plant them in this intact way. Hacha lav hainzri ato. But here you're doing something very unusual. It's not typical to take mature grains that are already grown and uproot them and then replant them. And so the question is, does the replanting them make them a new plant or not? And we don't have an answer. So Rava leaves this question open, and then says Chanina bar Minyumi la Abaya. So Rabbi Chanina bar Minyumi says to Abaya, where am I? I don't know exactly how to find the place, but this is around 10 lines down. What about a pot that doesn't have a hole in it? What about a big planter? You take a huge planter, you put, your grain in the planter. I mean, I always like to use tomatoes, but even though tomatoes might not be chayiv d'oraita, but we all plant them, right? So you take your big planter and you don't have a hole in the bottom, so it's not attached to the ground. Maho, what's the halacha in that case? What do you mean, what's the question? Well, your question is if it grew, if it regrew, like what's your question, right? Maho, ilo nakuv, ilo nakuv. I don't get it. If there's no hole in the bottom, there's no hole, and then presumably you're only chayiv in truma maser midrabanan. We'll see this later, right? There's no real is chiyav doraita of something that's not in the ground, even if it's grain. There's not a chiyav doraita of truma and maser. So what's your question? Can you take truma on one or maser on one part on the other part? Dilma, what your question must be, says Abaya. Chazar v'nakvokam. You must be asking me what happens if you have this interesting case where you plant something in a big pot that is not attached to the ground. So it's a huge planter that has no holes in the bottom. And it starts growing. Let's say it grows, I don't know, 150%. And then, so now if you then harvested the grain or whatever grew in that pot, right, you don't have to take any truma maaser, but drabanan, you take maaser, and you could take it from, one tomato on all the other tomatoes because they're all chayv midrabanan. But what happens if then, in the middle of the growth, you make a hole in the bottom of the pot? And now, once you make a hole in the bottom of the pot, it's now attached to the ground, right? And then it keeps growing, right? So the tomatoes, in this case, keep growing. They get larger and larger. 50% of their growth happened after you made a hole in the bottom of the pot. The issue here is that the growth that happened after it connected to the ground is chayiv and truma maser doraita, because it basically grew in the ground. The growth that happened before is only chayiv midrabanan. And if you take off a whole tomato for your truma and maser, you're taking something that's drabanan on something that's doraita, right? So you're really stuck because some of the fruit is chayiv midrabanan, some is chayiv midoraita. Now, if you say, like Rava was asking, that you go batar ikar, you go after the initial thing, right? So there, maybe you say, okay, now that it's chayiv doraita, the whole fruit is chayiv doraita. But if you separate it, can you take off truma and maser from one part on itself? So do you say, this is the question, hacha, by the case of this is Abaya's answer, hacha, by the case of the flower pot, chadazriyahu. It's one planting, meaning there's clearly one growth of this tomato. The question is whether you connected it to the ground or not connected it. But there's it doesn't make any sense, as Abaya, to say that this tomato, or again, I use tomato, but really it should be a grain, that this piece of grain is considered to be two plantings, and maybe you're chayiv only maser on one and not on the other. Because it's one thing, you didn't change anything, you didn't actually touch the plant, you just made a hole in the bottom of the planter. But Hatam, by Rava's question, stays riotzinu. Rava's question was very different because in Rava's question, you actually replanted the thing that you had already harvested. And so there you can start asking questions. Is the initial one already fine and the second one doesn't add? But in this case where it's one planter, there would be no question. The fact is that once it's connected to the ground, it's chayiv truma maser doraita, and therefore the whole thing is chayiv and truma maser doraita. So there's no separation between the growth before and the growth after. That was Abaya's answer. Now, by Rabbi Avo continues the question in the same vein. Shibolet shemerchol b'kri. Here, you get a shibolet, right? A shibolet is a piece of a grain, like a stalk, let's say. I don't know if stalk is the right word, but a stalk of grain, right? Not an individual grain, but the stalk of it. And you smoothed it down in the pile. Now, mircho is work, right? To smooth it down. It's not breaking it up, but it's the first part in what we call miruach, where you start getting these things ready to be threshed and to separate the grain out from the chaff. So you did an action on it, and once you do an action, it's chayiv in maaser. It's called tevel. But then, instead of completing that, shtalo, you went back and you put it back in the ground, right? The same case as Rava. And then, now is where it gets interesting, because now you basically have a plant, it's back in the ground, and you say, I need to take truma and maaser. I want the piece in the ground to be the truma, right? The kara ala shem, you called it the name of truma b'michubar, when it's connected to the ground. So you said, I want to eat everything I have at home, and the part that's growing in the field, that's going to be the truma. Namahu. Can you make something in the ground truma? Do you say, Kiman de mercha, since you did the meruach, since you smoothed it down and you started you did an action to prepare it, tavlo hele. You made it into tevel, and therefore once it's tevel, it's in the parsha of truma and maser, and kikara lashem kachala. And once you then say it's the truma, it gets kodesh, it is truma, and growing in the ground is truma. Dilmar, do you say, one second, given to shatla, once you replanted it, paka letivla mine, its name of tevel went away because now it's a plant. It's not finished grain that is tevel. It's a plant. And if it's a plant, you can't make it into truma. Obviously, you can't walk into your field and say, that part of the field is truma. You have to have harvested it and prepared it in order for something to be truma. So the question is, you did that here, but then you replanted it. So did you take away the name of tevel? So that was the question of Rabbi Avo. Again, so just the obvious continuation of the questions we've been having. And so Amar Le, Rabbanan Abaya, Rabbanan said to Abaya, I don't really, before we get into the details, it's impossible. Because in Cain, if that was the halacha that you can make this plant into truma, matzino truma b'mechuber lekarka, you would then turn out that you have something that's truma that's growing in the ground. V'tznanan, we have a Mishnah. It's not really clear where this is because it's not in a Mishnah that we have. But V'tznan, we have in a Mishnah, or you could say in a Braita, right? That, which again, I can't read. I'm sorry, I'm online, so I can't read what the Gimel is in mine, but I assume that's what it says. V'tznan, we learned, lo matzino truma b'mechubar lekarka, that there's no such thing as truma that's attached to the ground. So obviously can't be the case for whatever, again, we don't exactly know why, but there's a Mishnah that says you can't have truma that's connected to the ground, and therefore there's no way that if you take your grain and you harvest it and it's chayiv and it becomes tevel and you replant it, that you can call it truma. Amalei, so Abai said back to Rabbanan, you're making a mistake. Because Kitanya, when you learn that Braita that says Ein Truma b'mechubar lekarka, there's no Truma when it's attached to the ground, that's saying there's no Truma, so that meaning le'inyan ahi, le'inyan ichyuve mita v'chomesh. There it's talking about, in terms of, remember, if you eat truma and you're not a Kohen, you get chayiv mita b'dei shamayim, and you have to pay back the principal and an extra fifth, which is a quarter, right? So you have to pay back. But that's only true if it's disconnected, if it's out, regular food. The talish v'achel, if you uproot it and you eat it, talushu. It might still be, says Abaya, meaning I can't resolve it, that it might still be that you can make something truma even though it's growing in the ground. If you then uproot it and eat it, it is truma. It's just that you can't be chayiv for eating truma if it's on the ground. And that's because igachin va'achel, if you bend over and put your like an animal and you chew the food on the ground that's still attached, of course you're not chayav because that's not eating. But it's called adam. We don't call that eating. It's considered to be, not a normal thing to do, to act like an animal and eat off the ground. And so it's not a masa v'achila. But that's not saying that you can't have truma in something that is attached to the ground. So therefore, it's not, I don't have an answer, says Abaya, but you can't prove that you can't have truma from the Mishnah or the Braita that says that you're not chayav when it's attached to the ground. So that was, so it's unresolved. Says the Gemara, well, but there is a halacha that's somewhat similar, very interesting halacha, that was written down, Ma'ishna midichtav a pinkasa de ilfa. Why is this different than the situation that was written down, the case in the pinkas? The pinkas is like a notebook of Ilfa. So, it used to be Ilfa was an Amora, of course, and it used to be that they, they didn't write down the Gemara, but they would write down notes, and people would keep notes. And obviously, I don't know how long they lasted for, but they found the pinkas of Ilfa, and they found that he wrote an interesting halacha. He wrote there, Beitze nivlat ta'of hatohor, right? Remember, you have a bird that is a tahar, which becomes a nevela, dies. It's not shechted, right? So remember, the halacha is that such a bird is mitameh. It's called a beit habli'ah, right? If you touch the bird, you're not tameh, even though it's a nevela. Remember, a tameh is different, but a nevela of an of tahar, chicken that died without shechita. If you touch it, you're not tameh. But if you swallow it, it's mitameh, what's called beit habli'ah, in your throat. Okay. Now, the question here is that your eggs that were in this bird when the bird died. And so the question is, are those eggs considered part of the bird? In which case, if you swallow them, you're tameh. or they consider it to be external to the bird, in which case, of course, they're not mitame at all, right? If a bird lays an egg and then dies, the eggs don't become tamei, right? They were laid before it died. So the question is, of course, as Ilfa thought, what if the animal dies, the bird dies, and the eggs are partially inside and partially outside? They're in the process of laying the egg. So you have an egg, a beitzei nivlat oftar, miksatan b'chutz miksatan bifnim. Part of the egg is outside of the bird, and part of the egg is inside of the bird. So said Ilfa in his notebook, mibifnim, the egg that are inside the bird, right? That's considered part of the bird. It's not considered an egg, a separate entity. If it's inside the body of the bird, mitamim begadim beit it will be mitameh a person who eats it, his clothing, if he swallows it. So if you eat that egg with the bird, right? You cook the chicken and you eat it with the egg, that egg is mitameh. But mi b'chutz, the part that's outside, ein mitamim begadim beit that's not mitameh begadim abeit avliya. Now, what does this have to do with anything? The point of this, as the Gemara is saying, is that what kind of eating is it to go down, right, and eat an egg that's attached to a bird, stick in your mouth like it's something completely unusual to eat, right? And there you see basically that it's still mitameh. So we're said just now that eating that's unusual eating doesn't count as eating, but here with the bird, it's clearly seems very similar, right? When you're eating an egg that's inside of a bird, that's still called eating. Answers the Gemara, well, there's a real big difference because there, talush, when you talking about an egg, right? When eggs come out of a bird, of course, right? People always eat these eggs of the bird when they're outside, but when it's attached, people don't eat it, right? And what the point we're saying is that it's an egg is something that is eaten when it's separated, when it's detached, right? And even an egg that's inside of a bird, and obviously we don't see this a lot, but the Gemara talks about it all the time, so I guess it wasn't so uncommon. You can shech the bird and find an egg inside the bird, right? Meaning an egg could be ready to lay, a bird, sorry, can be ready to lay an egg, and you shecht it, right? Remember, we've talked a lot about what the status is of those eggs. They're part of their meat. They're not eggs, right? Because they're inside the bird. So there, an egg is something that people, in fact, do eat, but a piece of grain that's attached to the ground, people don't eat that. And so therefore, it's not considered to be eating if a person leans down to the ground and chews on a piece of grain, and therefore they would not be chayav for truma, not because it's not truma, but because it's not eating, it's not a normal act of eating. So we don't really resolve the question as to whether you can replant your tevel and still call it truma. The final, I think we'll do the final case before the Mishnah is Rav Tavyumi bar Avin, right? So said, where am I? Says Rav Tavyumi bar Kisna, sorry, around 10 lines on the bottom. Amar Rav Tavyumi bar Kisna, Amar Shmuel. Rav Tavyumi bar Kisna said in the name of Shmuel, what if you are Zorea, he didn't ask a question, he said a statement. Hazorea kilayim ba'atzit shenu nakuv. If you take mixed species, right? You plant two things, grapes and we had yesterday onions, in a pot that does not have a hole in the bottom. So remember, that if you have a pot that doesn't have a hole in the bottom, it's not considered to be planting in the ground. So you might think you can do whatever you want there. Said Rav Tavyumi bar Kisma, if you plant kalayim, it's asur. You're not allowed to do that. So said Abaya, I don't understand what he's talking about. Bishlama yashmina loke makat mardut midrabanan. If Rav Tavyumi bar Kisna said, if you do that, you get makot mardut. Remember, makot mardut means not where the Torah requires you to get lashes, but where the Chachamim came up with the halacha of lashes. Then Shaper, then he would have been telling me something innovative and something that was useful for me. And La Asur, to tell me that it's Asur, Michael Mashmalon, everyone knows it's Asur. What's he telling me? That Midrabanan Habizriya? That even though you're planting it in a pot that is not attached to the ground, the rabbis consider that to be planting, Midrabanan. Tanina, that's a Mishnah Masechet Tamai. The Mishnah says, Taram Mishaino Nakuv ala Nakuv. If you take Truma, from a grain that grew in a planter that does not have a hole in it, so it's not connected to the ground, on grain that was grown from the ground, which is in a planter with a hole, it is truma v'yachzor v'yitrom. It's truma because it's drabanan truma, but it doesn't count for the other one because the other one's chayiv in truma d'oraita, and you have to take truma again. So I see very clearly from the Mishnah and Demai that although things that grow in a pot without connection to the ground are not chayiv d'oraita, they are chayiv drabanan because you can take truma. And so, of course, you're chayiv and klayim. So I appreciate your halacha, but really it's not that innovative, and we already knew it. So that is where we end this sugya. But it's true, it's just nothing really that innovative. That's his claim. Okay, continues the Mishnah now after that very exciting topic of plants and growth and all of that. We get to the question of what is considered grain, right? And we're going to see in 1 second that this is an incredibly relevant issue for Pesach, right? Because on Pesach, we have grain many times. Matzah has to be made out of grain, and chametz can't be made out of grain, right? Or chametz is only from grain, right? Maybe. Not rice, depending on your tradition. So what are the categories of grain, says the Mishnah? Hachitin, right? The 5 categories, we all know this, I think. The 5 categories of grain are chitin, which we translate as wheat, seor and barley, kusmin, spelt. I don't know what these things are. Shibolet, shua, we often say oats. It's very much debated whether that's true. And shipon, which again, my translate is rye. Which are all 5 different types of grain, except for oats, which aren't really grain. So these are the 5 different types of grain. Hare elu chayavim b'chala. All of these things, if you take them, and obviously challah is a minimum shear, but if you have a minimum shear, you have to take off challah. And mitztarfin zemzeh, they all combine with each other to be mechayiv challah. Let's say you have half of a shear of chitin and half of seorin, they combine with each other if you put the dough together. The asurin b'chadash minifnei Pesach. All 5 of these grains are prohibited to eat if it's before Pesach. So if you have Cheerios, which are made out of oats, right, from last year, you're not allowed to, or sorry, Cheerios from this year, right? You're not allowed to eat them until if you are Chadash, at least in the Eretz Yisrael, whatever, you're not allowed to eat them until Pesach. Of course, the word Pesach here is a little confusing because it's not Pesach that permits grain, it's the Omer. And some people change the girsa, and we'll see that we interchangeably use, well, not interchangeably, but we mix a little bit here, Pesach and Omer. Right? The Omer is done on the second day of Pesach, but the thing that matters the grain is not Pesach, it's the Omer. Right? But anyways, our Mishnah says you cannot eat them if they're Chadash before Pesach, and you can't be Kotzer milifnei Omer. Now, this is a very new halacha. We've mentioned it before, that not only are you not allowed to eat the new grain, but you can't harvest the new grain before you bring the carbon omer. So you can't work in the field. You're not allowed to get the grain ready before the omer, and we'll see why in the Gemara. Now, says the Mishnah, we quoted this Mishnah yesterday, Im hishrishu kodem la'omer, if the plant gets roots before the omer, then omer matiran. Then anything that grows after the omer becomes permitted, because as long as the wheat had roots, that's considered to be growing, and the omer is matir. But imlav, if it did not have roots, then asurin ad shiavo omer haba, right? Then it's asur until the next year. Now, just before we get into the details of these last points, what are these 5 minim? Tanis of the Mishnah, the Braita said, kusmin is min chitin, right? That we actually combine them into groups. So remember, there's 5 types, but there's chita, which is wheat, and kusmin, which we translate as spelt, is a type of wheat, and they combine. We'll see why in a second. Like, what do they combine for? Shibolet, shual, the shifon, the other 2, which we translate as oats and rye, those are min saorim. Those are like barley. Okay? Now, what are these things? The Gemara gives you a very helpful explanation. Unfortunately, it's in Aramaic, but the Gemara gives you a very helpful explanation of what these things are. So, kusmin are gulba. That's what we call gulba. Now, again, gulba doesn't help us much more than the word kusmin, but I guess in Aramaic, gulba means something. Rashi provides a very helpful French word, ashpelta, which I guess means a lot like spelt, right? So it sounds like spelt, but I don't really know much of that. So that's what gulba is. Shifon, which again we translate as rye, it's dishra. That's what we call in Aramaic dishra. And Rashi here says sigla. I don't know if that's a word. And shibolet shual, which we translate as oats, is shibule ta'ala. It's shibule ta'ala, which is the Aramaic word for shual. So, anyways, that and Rashi there says avina, which again I don't know if that means oats, but that's how we translate it usually. Anyways, the Gemara says hani in. These are the only things that you can.
Actually, that word I recognized. It's like,
Oats? Is that what it means?
Avina is Avwan. It's like it's oats. Yeah.
Okay,
You know
great.
the brand Avino?
Yeah.
Like, like which is
Cream?
like yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, that's where it comes from.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
It doesn't
So
spell the same way, but anyway.
says the Gemara, Haniin, second line. These are the only things that are considered grain. Orez v'dochan lo, but orez, which we always translate as rice, though there's debate about whether that's the correct translation. And dochan, which they translate in my Gemara as millet, right, which is a kernel basically that you're turning into things. Those are not considered to be grain. They're not, you can't make flour. Minani meal. Well, you can make flour, but it's not for mincha. It's not usher before the omer. It's not useful for Pesach. It's not chametz. Minani meal. Now, how do you know all this? Amrish lakish atya lechem lechem mimatzah. In fact, the source for the carbon of mincha is from matzah. Because k'tivacha, it says by the mincha to omer that haya ba'achal lechem haaretz, right? That you have to eat after the omer lechem haaretz. So you see, it's called lechem. And k'tivhatam, it says by matzah lechem oni. It has to be lechem oni. So just like by matzah, matzah can only be made from the 5 grains. So too, the minchat omer only applies to the 5 grains. As for vatam gufa minalan, how do you know that matzah only applies to the 5 grains? Amar Reish Lakish, v'chein tanan deber Rabbi Yishmael, v'chein tanan deber Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. It's based on the pasuk. The pasuk on Markra says, "Lo tochal alav chametz shivat yamim." Right? Or I would read it the other way. Lo tochal alav chametz, comma. Don't eat chametz. Shivat yamim tochal alav matzot. 7 days you eat matzot lechem oni. So there's a connection between chametz and matzah. Dvarim habayim lidei chimutz. Things that become leavened. Adam yotzei b'hem midei chavato b'Pesach. Things that become leavened, you can use, and therefore they're prohibited for chametz. That's what you can use for matzah. And yatsu elo, excluding things like rice and millet, they don't become leavened. Ela lidei seirachon. If you mix them with water, they become seirachon, which we usually mean is like rotting almost, but maybe like a chemical reaction where it definitely changes, but it doesn't become rising. It doesn't rise the way grain rises. Again, this gets to very technical halachot, like what other, we find new grains. What about new grains? What about new world things? How do we look at these things? And that's obviously a lot of halachic debate because it's very relevant for Pesach. Now, the Mishnah said, umitztarfin zem zeh, that these 5 types of grain combine to each other, right? Tana, now in fact, we have a Braita which says this clearly, that hatfu'ah v'hakemachim v'habitsekot mitztarfim zem zeh, that in fact, not only do the grains combine, but the different types of preparation, tfu'ah meaning the stalk, basically, of the grain, the kemach, which is the flour, and the batzek, which is the dough, right? Meaning you already mixed the flour with water and it's already fermenting. All of those 3 types of preparation of the grain, or 3 stages, are mitztarfim zem zeh, they combine with each other. What does it mean they combine with each other? Amar Rav the in chadash. It's telling you, li'in chadash, that they're all prohibited to eat or to use before you bring the new karban mincha. Rav Yosef says li'in chametz b'Pesach. It's telling you in terms of chametz, right? What does that mean? That you can have chametz even of the grain. So it's not just the flour and the dough that becomes chametz. If you take the grain and you soak it in water, it becomes chametz too. Which of course why we're very makbid on shomer, right? Matzah shmura, etc. So you watch the grains. Rav Papa says, Inyan Maaser Sheni. No, it's referring to Inyan Maaser Sheni, where you need to have a certain minimum size. This to be a size of a kizayit. And Iyachal Lechutz the Choma, if you eat a kizayit outside of the walls of Yerushalayim, lucky you get makot, right? But that could combine, even if you eat, part of it is grain, and part of it is flour, and part of it is dough. So they combine with each other. That's the first 3 answers. Rava says, Linyan Tumat Ochlim. It's the Indian tuma. Again, the same thing. That tuma requires a minimum size. And this is the chiddush that you can actually become tamei when you're talking about grain. Grain is not processed yet, and kemach is just flour. But tu'ah ukmachim dumya debetsekot. It teaches you that the flour and the grain is like the batsek. It's like the dough that just like mahatam uchla be'ena, just like dough, you can eat a piece of dough, like in cookie dough ice cream. Here too, there are people who, if you're very hungry, you can eat some flour that's raw, or you can eat a kernel of grain. You could chew on it and get some nourishment out of it. So therefore, if you do eat it, you're chayav in tuma or maaser, etc. All the halachot. Says in Vatanya, there's a Braita, in fact, that supports this, because the Braita says chita, that if you're talking about grain, bein klufa, bein she'eno klufa mitzarefet, whether you have the shell on it, meaning the layers of that are outside a piece of grain, like when you pick grain in the field, right, wild wheat, there's all kinds of layers on top of that grain of wheat. Says the Braita, whether it's been shelled, or bein she'eno klufa, or it's not been taken off the shell, meaning it's still attached, it's still wrapped in that shell, mitzarefet, it can combine for tum'ah, right? But seorah, but barley, which presumably has a harder shell. Again, I don't grow these things, so I can't say for sure. But Seorah, which has a harder shell, the outside actually is not mitzdaref. There's a lot of different opinions. Rashi quotes a couple, one from his teachers that he doesn't like, one that he does like. But the shell, klufa, the shell of the barley mitzdaref. I'm sorry, if it's shelled. So if it no longer has the surrounding outside husk, it's mitzdaref, and you can use it for considered it food. And therefore, if you take a small piece of barley and another piece of barley and another, maybe barley grains and barley flour and barley dough, it's all mitzdaref. But she'eno klufa, if it's not shelled, then a mitzdarefet, because that's not considered to be edible, because you have to chew through this husk that's not considered to be doable. So therefore, it's only if you take off the shell that it's mitzdaref. There's other pshatim about whether it's talking about the klipa, but we're just gonna read what I just said. Go with what I said, I think. So that is the meaning that these things combine, that they're considered to be food, that in fact you can basically eat the seed itself, not the seed, the kernel of grain as some nourishment. Amy says, is that really true though? Is it true that you in fact do not include the shell of barley that has a shell around it is not considered to be food because it's too hard to eat? Well, it's Rabbi Yishmael, but there's a bright of Rabbi Yishmael which says, based on the pasuk, which says, "Al kol zera zeru asher yizareya." Right, the Torah talks about if something tamei falls on any seed that you're about to plant, what that means is that seeds, kederach shebnei adam motzim lizriah, that seeds become tamei in the way that a person would take it out to plant it, meaning chita b'klipata, grain in a wheat, in its shell, sora b'klipata, barley in its shell, adashim b'klipatan, or lentils in their shells, meaning all of these things, they are tamei, even intact, even with the layers around them. So you see that even barley, which we're saying the layers around barley are considered to be very thick or very inhospitable to eating, it's still tamei. Lokasha answers the Gemara, well, there's a difference because there's lachot and yeveshot. It depends on whether the shell, the barley, is dry or if it's moist. The opposite in the Gemara. Lach means moist. If it's moist, then what happens, Rashi explains, is that the shell basically sticks to the barley, right? When it's, you can't separate, you can't like when things are very dry, you can separate them easily. So if the barley is dry, then you don't consider the shell to be a hepsic because it'll just come right off, right? You just rub it a little bit and everything falls off. But if it's moist, if it's wet, it's rained on it, or it's just fresh from growing, then it's very hard to separate the layers. And therefore, it's like peanuts, right? They were very, very hard to separate when they're moist. That's why we roast them. But when you dry them, you can separate them. So therefore, the shell is considered to be a separation if it's wet, because then you can't eat the barley. But if it's dry, the shell is not considered to be a separation, and it's considered to be tamei. Okay, that is enough about barley, I guess, for now. But going back to the Mishnah said, we're at the two dots, that all of these grains are asurin b'chadash m'nefnei Pesach. That before Pesach or before the Omer, you're not allowed to eat them. How do you know that? Not immediately. It says Reish Lakish, atya lechem lechem imatzah. The same thing I said before, right? It says lechem by. We're saying this for a reason. You'll see. We're just continuing. But we said lechem by matzah, and we learned from matzah, from chametz, that it has to be one of the five grains. That's the only things that you can have from matzah. And so too, the matzah can only be five grains, and therefore the omer only applies to the five grains. And we said in the Mishnah that you can't be kotzer, you can't cut down the new grain lifnei omer. You're not even allowed to harvest it. Not immediately. How do you know that? Maybe you just can't eat it. How do you know you can't harvest it? Reb Yochanan, because it says reshit michala. It says the word reshit by chala, meaning you have to give the first dough to the Kohen, and it says the word reshit by reshit kitzirchem by the Omer. And just like by challah, it has to be the first thing that you give. So by the Omer, it's the first crop, meaning that it has to be. It says by, this is before we get to the Omer. It says by challah. It says by the new tfuah, it says that you should bring the first part to the Kohen. My kodem laomer. Now, what happens before the Omer? What does it mean when it says you should do it? You can't do it my in the Mishnah, when it says you can't bring anything before the Omer, right? It says in the Mishnah you can't eat it and you can't harvest it before the Omer. Now, what does that mean before the Omer? Rabbi Yona Amar kodem kitzirata Omer. It means before you cut down the Omer. So remember, they would cut down the Omer the night before, let's say, right? And so before you can't cut down any of your grain before you cut down the omer. The omer has to be the first thing done. But once they cut down the omer, you can start cutting down your grain. But Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda says it means kodem hava'at omer. It means before the karban ha'omer, which is the next day, right? So the machloket Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda is whether you're allowed to harvest your crops after you cut down the omer and before you bring the karban ha'omer, which of course makes a little bit of a difference because, if you can do it after you cut them down, then you have all night basically to go out and harvest your grain and make fresh challah for the next morning. Or it's Pesach, so I guess fresh matzah for the next morning, right? But if you hold that it's from the time that you actually bring the omer, then you'd have to wait until the karban omer is brought in order to cut down your grain. So that is the machloket Reb Yonah and Reb Yossi Bar Zavda. Now it's not. Says maybe we can figure out an answer from the Mishnah because our Mishnah used two different descriptions. First, our Mishnah said that these five grains are asurin bechadash lifnei Pesach. You can't eat them before Pesach, and you can't cut them down before the Omer, like tzar b'fnei Omer. Now, Lishna Lamanda Amar Kodem Avata Omer, according to according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda, who said that it's talking about before bringing the Omer. So now I understand there's two different times. One time is Lifnei Pesach, and one time is Lifnei Havata Omer. So Hainu Deloka Arav Lu V'Tanilei. That's why we didn't combine them and just say, don't eat it and don't harvest it, because they're different times for them, right? But according to El Lamandam, according to Ksirata Omer, according to it probably should be the opposite here, right? But according to the one who said, Kodem Kitsirat Omer, sorry, I'm just trying to get my Gemara a little bigger. According to the one who said it's before the cutting down of the Omer, right? So then basically there are two different times, right? So I'm sorry, then there's only one time because cutting down the Omer happened before Pesach because you're not allowed to cut down new things on Pesach, right? So then why don't we combine them together and say Asurin bechadash v'liktsor lifnei Pesach, right? Why doesn't it then say you're not allowed to eat the chadash? You're not allowed to cut things down before Pesach, because if it's referring to the Ketzira has to be done before Pesach, right? And so therefore you can combine them in the same thing. There's no difference between the two shiurim. So that seems to prove like one opinion. Ella says Gemara, Itmar, in fact, the machloket of Reb Yonah and Resi Bar Zavda is not about the question of when you have to cut them down. The machloket between them, Itmar Asefet, their machloket is about the second part of the Mishnah. The second part of the Mishnah said, Im Ishrishu Kodem LaOmer HaOmer Matiran. If the grain rooted before the Omer, right, you planted your grain, if it took root before the Omer, then the karban Omer is matir. Now, what does that mean before the Omer? My Kodem LaOmer. So obviously the simple reading is Kodem bringing the Omer. So Rabbi Yonah says that's what it means. Kodem Hava'ata Omer. It means before you bring the Omer. But Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda says, no, I disagree. It means Kodem Kitsirat Omer. It means before you actually do the harvesting of the Omer, not before the actual bringing of the Omer. And this makes it a little bit shorter, right? Because basically what this means is that if you planted your grain, say 3 days before Pesach, right? It has to take root by the time you harvest the Omer, not by the time that you bring the Omer. And so you only get till the night before, you don't get till the day of the Karban. We're going to see tomorrow at the bottom line here of Amrli Rabbi Eliezer, the actual source. How do we even know this whole concept, right? How do you know that grain that took root in the ground that isn't growing yet, right? It's not a stalk, it's not up in the ground, you don't see it. How do you know that the Omer is matter that grain? God willing, tomorrow we will pick up from the bottom line to learn that. So, Asher Koachol, good to learn together. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see
Shavua
you.
Tov.
Shavua Tov.